June 23rd, 1942. The Pacific sky hung low, a tapestry of bruised clouds bleeding into the horizon. Through the haze of salt and smoke, the sea stretched endlessly, a grey mirror of exhaustion and defeat. Aboard a US Navy destroyer, a young ensign raised his binoculars. The glass caught a glint of movement, tiny dots adrift on the restless ocean. At first they looked like debris, but as the waves rolled closer, the truth surfaced. Men. Japanese men. Bare-chested, sunburned, clinging to pieces of splintered wood and oil-stained wreckage. No one spoke for a moment. The silence on deck was heavy. Not the silence of peace, but of calculation. These were enemy soldiers, survivors from a Japanese warship sunk hours earlier. Men whose empire had sworn to fight to the last breath. Men taught that capture was the ultimate shame. The American sailors stood still, hands hovering over their rifles. Training and instinct collided with morality. For months, they had been told the Japanese never surrendered, that mercy was meaningless in this kind of war. And yet, here they were, calling weakly for help in broken English, their voices carried by the wind, drowned in salt and guilt. One petty officer muttered, "They'd never do the same for us." Another replied quietly, "But we're not them." The captain, an older man whose eyes carried the weight of too many mornings like this, gave a single nod. "Lower the boats." The command cut through the tension like a blade. Within minutes, the Americans were hauling their enemies, half dead, trembling, from the Pacific. The sailors wrapped them in blankets, offered canteens of water, even lit cigarettes for them. It was an image that defied every wartime instinct, every propaganda reel, every word printed in newspapers back home. Because according to the stories, the Japanese were fanatics, savages, beyond reason. And yet, here they sat on the deck of an American warship, too weak to raise their heads, while their supposed enemies tended to their wounds with quiet, deliberate kindness. In the following days, as these men were transported to makeshift prison camps across the Pacific and eventually to the United States, their disbelief only deepened. They expected interrogation, starvation, perhaps even execution. What they found instead was order, discipline, and most confusing of all, respect. It wasn't the kind of respect born from friendship, not yet. It was the respect of procedure, of a system that believed even enemies deserved dignity under the laws of war. To the Americans, this was duty. To the Japanese, it was an impossible contradiction. Imagine for a moment what they saw. Barbed wire fences stretching under the Californian sun, not as cages, but boundaries. Guards greeting them with a curt nod instead of a rifle butt. Meals served on time. Medical care without hesitation. The same soldiers who, days earlier, had fired upon them now offered soup, blankets, even newspapers. And in the silence of the barracks at night, whispers spread among the prisoners. Uncertain, almost fearful whispers. Are they mocking us? Why are they so polite? Is this a trick before punishment? To men raised in the Imperial Japanese Army, where surrender was treason, where mercy was weakness, this treatment was not kindness. It was incomprehensible. War, after all, had taught them a different language of honor. On Pacific Islands, surrendering soldiers were told to take their own lives rather than fall into enemy hands. Officers preached the Bushido Code, that to die for the emperor was the greatest glory, and to be captured was to erase your name forever. And yet, As these prisoners were led through the gates of American camps, they encountered something far more dangerous to their beliefs: humanity. The Americans, bound by the Geneva Convention, treated prisoners of war as soldiers without weapons, not beasts to be punished. They were counted, clothed, fed, and even given access to libraries and sports fields. One prisoner would later write in his journal, "I had prepared myself to die. Instead, I was handed a toothbrush. It was a small thing, trivial to those who gave it, but to the captured men, it shattered everything they thought they knew about their enemy." This was a paradox that rippled far beyond the camp fences. Back in Tokyo, few could imagine such mercy existed. Japanese propaganda portrayed American prisons as hellish torture grounds, where men were starved, beaten, and forced to betray their homeland. And so, when captured soldiers later testified to their humane treatment, they were branded liars, or worse, traitors. Yet behind those fences, something remarkable was unfolding. The seeds of understanding, however small, were being planted between two worlds that had only ever met in blood. The American guards, some no older than 20, learned that their captives were not monsters, but young men who had simply fought for the flag they were born under. And the Japanese prisoners, hardened by indoctrination and fear, began to see cracks in the stories they'd been told. Cracks that let in something they had long been taught to reject: empathy. It was not a grand moment of reconciliation, nor an act of political theatre. It was 1,000 quiet gestures: a bandaged hand, a shared cigarette, a respectful nod during roll call, that transformed hostility into bewildered gratitude. In the stillness of camp life, these men began to question not only their enemy, but the very meaning of honor itself. Why had they been told that Americans were demons? Why did these demons treat them as men? And what did it mean, after years of brutality, to experience compassion from the other side? The answers to these questions would not come easily. For some, they never came at all. But for many Japanese POWs, those years in American captivity marked the first time they saw war not as a holy crusade, but as a human tragedy. Some of them, decades later, would speak of it with tears in their eyes. The moment they realized that mercy could be stronger than vengeance. They remembered the guards who smiled without mockery, the doctors who treated wounds without distinction, and the cooks who prepared meals for men they had once sworn to kill. They remembered, above all, how politeness, that simple, powerful weapon of civility, could disarm hatred more completely than any bullet. As the war dragged on, the number of Japanese prisoners grew. From the jungles of Burma to the islands of Saipan and Okinawa, thousands would be captured and brought to American camps, and in each camp, the same quiet astonishment repeated itself: disbelief, suspicion, and finally, reluctant respect. This was not the narrative of victors and vanquished. It was something subtler, more human, a glimpse of who people can be when the machinery of war pauses, if only for a moment. In time, some of these former prisoners would return to Japan carrying not hatred, but confusion, and for a few, admiration. They had seen the discipline of their captors, the fairness of their systems, and the strange paradox that in defeat, they had been treated with a dignity they sometimes denied their own. It was a revelation that would quietly shape post-war Japan's understanding of America, a seed that would later grow into the unlikely alliance between two nations once sworn to annihilate each other. But in 1942, none of this was yet written. The world was still burning, and mercy was still a dangerous choice. On that destroyer deck in the middle of the Pacific, when the captain gave his order to rescue the enemy, He could not have known that his act, small, procedural, almost forgotten, would echo far beyond that day. Because sometimes, history turns not on battles or treaties, but on moments of decency. Moments when soldiers remember they are still men. When compassion cuts through the noise of hatred. And when, against all expectation, an enemy extends his hand. Not in surrender, but in respect. This is the story of those moments, of the Japanese prisoners who expected cruelty and found something else entirely, of the Americans who treated their captives with civility in the midst of total war, and of the strange, enduring power of politeness, even on the battlefield. The story of how Japanese prisoners of war came to be treated with such civility by American guards is not a simple tale of kindness. It is, rather, a convergence of ideologies, military systems, and human instincts. An encounter between two civilizations at their most extreme. When the Pacific War erupted in 1941, the world's oceans became a vast chessboard of cruelty and calculation. Every island, every convoy, every grain of sand had to be bought with blood. For both America and Japan, it was a war of annihilation, fought not merely for victory, but for identity itself. And yet, amid that relentless tide, there existed quiet pockets of restraint, moments when the machinery of war faltered and men remembered the fragile boundaries of humanity. It began with orders written in calm, bureaucratic English. The United States would follow the Geneva Convention of 1929. The document, born from the ashes of the First World War, outlined the treatment of captured soldiers, not as spoils of war, but as individuals with rights. American military training emphasized it. Captured enemies were to be processed, documented, and detained, not punished. It was a system designed less from mercy than from order. In the American mind, discipline and decency were intertwined. A soldier who mistreated a prisoner was a soldier who betrayed his own uniform. But for the Japanese, this concept was alien. The Empire of Japan had not signed the Geneva Convention. In their doctrine, surrender was not regulated, it was erased. Their code, the Bushido, demanded absolute loyalty, even unto death. A captured soldier ceased to exist, his name struck from family records, his memory steeped in disgrace. And so, when Japanese soldiers were taken prisoner, they entered not just enemy territory, but a parallel moral universe. In the first major captures of 1942, after the fall of Guadalcanal and the island skirmishes of the Solomons, American troops encountered Japanese soldiers who resisted to the end. Many refused rescue, choosing suicide over shame. Those who did surrender often did so in delirium, wounded, starving, clinging to life by instinct alone. The American guards, hardened by propaganda that painted their enemy as merciless killers, expected the worst. Yet when the prisoners arrived, skin stretched over bone, eyes hollow, voices cracked, the image of the fanatical beast dissolved. They were boys, some barely 18. Many could not speak English. Others whispered apologies, terrified of punishment that never came. At Camp McCoy in Wisconsin, one of the first large Japanese POW facilities on American soil, winter hit hard. Snow blanketed the barracks in silence. The guards, many of them farmers and factory workers before the war, were astonished to see prisoners bowing deeply before meals, lining up with perfect precision, speaking to officers in tones of humility and fear. They behaved as if every moment was an inspection, one guard recalled. They couldn't believe we let them walk, talk, even laugh. To the Japanese prisoners, the routine was surreal. They had prepared for torture. Instead, they were given blankets. They expected hunger. Instead, they were issued rations nearly identical to those of their captors. Each gesture of fairness unsettled them. It felt like a trick, or worse, pity. But it wasn't pity. It was policy. The American approach to prisoners was built on structure. Camps were run by officers who saw themselves as custodians of order, not vengeance. They maintained strict schedules, roll calls, work details, education programs, even sports tournaments. To the Americans, this was practical psychology. Keeping prisoners occupied reduced tension and rebellion. But to the Japanese, it was a revelation. They were used to a military system that broke individuality in service of collective obedience. Yet here, even as captives, they were treated as men, counted, addressed by name, given room to think. Some began to write diaries. Others formed choirs or study groups, teaching one another English or mathematics. A few, with trembling hands, sketched portraits of their guards, men they had once been ordered to hate. In one camp, an American sergeant noticed a prisoner refusing to eat his rations. Concerned, he asked through a translator why. The prisoner replied, "Because the food is too good for a defeated man." The sergeant said nothing, then sat beside him and shared the same meal. That moment, captured in a journal later recovered after the war, became a quiet emblem of what separated the two armies. For one, honor was submission to death. For the other, it was the discipline to treat even the defeated with dignity. Still, not every encounter was peaceful. In the Pacific, far from the order of mainland camps, emotions often overruled ideals. After brutal island battles, Tarawa, Iwo Jima, Okinawa, American troops, traumatized by kamikaze attacks and the mutilation of their comrades, sometimes shot surrendering Japanese out of fear or fury. War dehumanizes. Rules written in ink can vanish in smoke and blood. Yet, even there, a pattern emerged. Once prisoners were formally captured and brought under guard, the machinery of procedure reasserted itself. They were fed, sheltered, recorded. To American command, this was not mercy. It was identity. The treatment of prisoners was a reflection of civilization itself. The United States wanted to demonstrate that its moral authority was stronger than Japan's fanaticism. In that sense, every meal given, every courtesy extended, was not only an act of humanity, but a strategic gesture, a message to the world that democracy did not need to mirror tyranny to win. The Japanese, for their part, struggled to process it. In their minds, politeness was not a virtue extended to enemies. It was a weapon of hierarchy, a sign of dominance. The American guards' courteous "sir" and "thank you" felt unsettling, almost mocking. But as weeks turned to months, they began to realize something deeper. This politeness was not strategy, it was habit. One former prisoner decades later recalled, "We thought they were pretending, but then we saw they treated each other the same way. That is when I understood. This is who they are." That realization, small as it was, carried a profound weight. It fractured years of imperial propaganda and opened a space for introspection. For the first time, many Japanese soldiers questioned the morality of the war they had fought. Inside the camps, the Americans introduced work programs, not forced labor, but vocational training. Prisoners farmed vegetables, built vegetables, and printed newsletters. Some were even allowed to send censored letters home, their words carefully monitored, but unmistakably humane. They worked under guard, but without chains. They stood under flags, but not under whips. To the outside world, this may have seemed trivial, but for men who had been told that surrender erased their humanity, the simple act of being treated fairly was transformative. At night, when the lights dimmed and the snow outside fell quietly over the wire fences, the prisoners whispered among themselves. Some prayed, others reflected. For the first time in their military lives, they were allowed to exist as individuals, not weapons, not tools, but men. And in that stillness, something began to shift. From a strategic perspective, the American treatment of POWs served multiple purposes. It maintained discipline among guards, prevented uprisings, and, perhaps most importantly, created a psychological advantage. Interrogators found that prisoners who were treated humanely were more likely to cooperate, not from fear, but from confusion and respect. It was, in a sense, a psychological operation rooted in decency. The Americans had discovered that mercy could be a form of persuasion. Moreover, the humane treatment of prisoners became a propaganda weapon of its own. Leaflets were dropped over battlefields, urging Japanese soldiers to surrender, promising food and safety under the stars and stripes. For those indoctrinated to believe Americans were monsters, this seemed impossible. But word spread, quietly, through whispers of captured comrades who lived. Some Japanese soldiers, cornered and desperate, chose to surrender because of those stories. And so, in a war defined by brutality, the image of an American guard offering a cigarette to a Japanese prisoner became not only symbolic, it became strategic. Yet, the paradox deepened. When the war ended in 1945, many Japanese POWs who returned home found themselves ostracized. Their stories of fair treatment were met with suspicion, even contempt. Some were accused of fabricating tales to absolve the enemy. Others kept silent for decades. In Japan, the myth of total loyalty remained powerful. To admit that one had been captured and treated kindly was to confess both defeat and disillusionment. But time has a way of softening edges. As the decades passed, the narratives began to resurface. Letters, memoirs, testimonies of those who had lived between two codes of honor. They spoke not of glory, but of awakening, of how their view of the enemy changed, not through ideology, but through the quiet, repetitive politeness of guards who never forgot their duty to humanity. In hindsight, historians would see these moments as small but pivotal. The American treatment of Japanese POWs influenced the broader rules of engagement that would later shape post-war international law. It also planted a moral precedent that would define America's self-image in the decades to come. The idea that strength is measured not only in power, but in restraint. And for Japan, the experience lingered like a faint echo, an uncomfortable memory that forced reflection on its own wartime values. Many of those former prisoners, in their later years, became advocates for peace. They spoke in classrooms, wrote memoirs, and warned against the blind loyalty that once consumed them. In their stories, one theme repeated. We lost the war, but we gained back our humanity. By the time the last camps closed and the fences came down, the war had already begun to fade into history. But the memory of that politeness, that disarming, inexplicable courtesy, remained. It had been the smallest of gestures in the vast machinery of global conflict, Yet it revealed something essential about the nature of civilization itself. That even in total war, there are limits to hatred. That discipline can coexist with compassion. And that sometimes the most powerful weapon a soldier can wield is respect. When the guns finally fell silent in August 1945, the world exhaled for the first time in years. The oceans that once roared with fire became still, and across the globe, behind the fences and barracks that had held them, thousands of Japanese prisoners of war looked to the horizon, unsure of what awaited them. For some, repatriation meant freedom. For others, it meant a return to a country they no longer recognized, or that no longer recognized them. The empire that had demanded their lives had fallen. Its cities lay in ash. Its emperor had spoken words unthinkable only months before. Surrender. The American guards, who had spent years tending to these men not as monsters, but as fellow soldiers, now faced their final duty, sending them home. It was a process defined not by triumph, but by quiet respect. Uniforms were folded, names were called, farewells exchanged in broken English, and careful bows. In those moments, a strange intimacy hung in the air, the intimacy of shared endurance. Two enemies who had seen each other at their weakest now stood side by side, bound not by orders, but by understanding. A letter survives from that time, written by an American lieutenant stationed at Camp McCoy. When I watched them board the train home, I realized that I no longer hated them. They were men, like us, tired of war, hungry for life. Maybe that is how wars should end, not with victory parades, but with forgiveness, quietly taking root in the wreckage. That letter, preserved in a museum archive, speaks more truth than most military reports. Because wars do not truly end with armistices. They end in the hearts of those who fought, when they choose to see the enemy as human again. The treatment of Japanese POWs by American guards was not just a matter of decency. It became a reflection of a nation's conscience at a time when morality itself was under siege. The world had seen horrors in those years. From Nanking to Bataan, from Dresden to Hiroshima, humanity seemed a fragile thread, easily burned by ideology and vengeance. And yet, somewhere in that darkness, small acts of restraint glimmered like faint stars. A guard offering water to a wounded prisoner. A medic stitching the wound of a man who had tried to kill him days before. An officer reminding his men that the enemy was still entitled to respect. Each act was insignificant in scale, but together they formed a pattern. A quiet resistance against barbarism. It was as if through politeness, through discipline, through the simple refusal to dehumanize, the Americans had built invisible bridges amid ruins. From a strategic lens, this behavior had ripples far beyond compassion. The humane treatment of POWs became a model, adopted and reinforced in later conflicts. The Geneva Conventions were expanded in 1949, inspired in part by lessons from the Second World War, lessons about what happens when civility collapses and what can happen when it doesn't. But perhaps the deeper legacy lay not in law, but in memory. For the Japanese soldiers who returned home, the experience became an inner mirror. Many had been taught that the enemy was soulless, decadent, incapable of honor. Instead, they had met men who treated them with dignity, even in victory. It was a realization that shattered the myth of moral superiority that had fueled Japan's militarism. One former prisoner, years later, stood at a veterans' gathering and said with trembling voice, "We learned Bushido from our officers, but we learned humanity from our captors." That line would later be quoted in books, in documentaries, in classrooms, a paradox so sharp and sincere, it pierced through ideology. And in that paradox lies the essence of this story. The Japanese POWs expected cruelty and found civility. The Americans expected monsters and found men. Both sides were forced to confront uncomfortable truths about themselves. The Japanese discovered that surrender did not erase honor, that dignity could exist even in defeat. The Americans discovered that victory did not grant moral exemption, that mercy was a discipline of its own. Between them, in the fragile corridor of barbed wire and protocol, they found something larger than either nation had intended. Proof that humanity can survive inside the machinery of war, if someone is willing to defend it. In the last 12, the decades that followed, the story faded from the headlines. History prefers its heroes grand and its villains clear. There is little room for nuance in the mythology of war, but in museums, in footnotes, and in the memories of those who lived it, the story endured. A retired Japanese schoolteacher, once a young POW, spent his life telling students about his experience. He would bring out a single photograph, him standing beside 2 American guards, all 3 smiling awkwardly in the cold Wisconsin air. He would tell them, "This was the first time I saw the face of my enemy, and the first time I saw what peace might look like." That photograph now hangs in a small exhibit in Tokyo. Its caption simple, almost haunting: kindness in captivity. To understand why such moments matter, we must remember the psychological architecture of war. Armies are trained to strip away empathy. To fight efficiently, soldiers must believe that their enemies are something less than human. The act of killing becomes easier when names are replaced with numbers, faces with helmets, people with targets. But when the war is over, when the helmets come off and the targets become men again, the hardest task begins: rebuilding that lost humanity. The American Guards, in their strict adherence to decency, were performing that rebuilding even before the war had ended. They proved that discipline was not only a weapon against the enemy, but against the chaos within oneself. That is why, decades later, when historians look back on the American POW camps, they often describe them as paradoxical oases, places where civility endured amid a world collapsing into madness. Of course, not all was perfect. There were moments of abuse, moments of anger and fatigue. Humanity is flawed, even in its best intentions. But compared to the brutal treatment that Allied prisoners suffered under Japan's own camps, where starvation, forced labor, and torture were routine, the contrast was staggering. It was a moral mirror, held up by history. And in that mirror, both nations would eventually see what kind of future they wished to build. For the United States, it affirmed an identity, a power that wielded compassion as proof of civilization. For Japan, it became part of a long reckoning, an internal confrontation with the ideals that had led it into catastrophe. The irony was profound. The nation that prided itself on honor learned humility from the enemy it had called barbaric. And the nation that wielded overwhelming power learned to restrain itself, not through fear, but through choice. The legacy of those encounters still lingers, not in monuments or medals, but in something subtler, more enduring. The shared moral vocabulary that underpins the modern relationship between the 2 nations. When Japan and the United States became allies in the decades after the war, they did so not only through politics and economy, but through a quiet recognition of mutual humanity. One first glimpsed behind barbed wire in the politeness of guards who offered their enemies tea instead of punishment. That courtesy, once seen as weakness, became the foundation for reconciliation. There's an old saying, "The measure of a civilization is how it treats those who can do it no harm." In the chaos of global conflict, the Americans who guarded Japanese prisoners measured their civilization in acts of decency. They followed rules that seemed almost naive in wartime, and yet those very rules became the scaffolding upon which post-war peace was built. Because strength without mercy is only domination, and mercy without strength is sentiment. But the balance of both, That is civilization. In the final years of their lives, many of the surviving Japanese POWs returned to America, not as prisoners, but as visitors. Some sought out the camps where they had once lived. Others met with their former guards. One such meeting took place in 1987 at a small town hall in Wisconsin. A frail Japanese man, now in his 70s, embraced an American veteran who had once been his guard. Both men wept. Reporters asked the Japanese man what he remembered most from those years. He paused, eyes glistening, and said simply, "They called me by my name." That single sentence, quiet and unadorned, carries the weight of everything this story represents. In war, identity is stripped away. To be called by one's name, to be seen, recognized, is to be given back one's humanity. And perhaps that is the invisible legacy of it all. The power of recognition. The refusal to let enmity erase empathy. Today, when technology can wage war from thousands of miles away, when drones replace pilots and screens replace faces, that lesson grows more urgent than ever. The distance between killer and killed has never been greater. The danger is not brutality, but indifference. Yet, if history still whispers through time, it says this: decency matters, even when no one is watching. Especially then. Because it was not treaties or weapons that defined the moral high ground in 1942. It was the quiet courtesy of men who refused to let hatred dictate their conduct. They did not win the war by being polite, but they showed that even in victory, humanity must survive.